So anybody that doesn't know me, I'm Tricia Thorpe. I'm your TNRD director for Area I. So questions, concerns, anything, I'm your point of contact. Always happy to listen to you. Um, just wanted to thank everybody for coming tonight to listen and learn now that the geohazard assessment's been done. So I'm going to introduce everybody. If they could just maybe give a wave in case we don't know them. Jamie is in the back. He is our general manager of operations with the TNRD. Mike Knopf in the orange, emergency program coordinator. Dale, I think you all know Dale. He was the TNRD recovery manager here. Trevor Bohe from Minister of Forests. Sitting next to Trevor is David Rice with emergency management and climate readiness. And last but not least is Carrie Hancock, senior geologist on this project. And I'm going to turn it over to Mike Knopf, and he's going to take it from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Tricia. So good evening, everyone. Mike Knopf. I'm the emergency program coordinator with the Thompson-Nicola Regional District. So really the only full-time emergency management person in the Thompson-Nicola. So it falls, on my plate to ensure that the government, the TNRD, is capable of responding to significant events and, assist with preparation, mitigation, and ultimately recovery. So it was through our emergency management organization that we retained the services of Dale, who I'm sure you're all familiar with, who filled that community recovery manager role for us. And so that's the sort of thing that we look at trying to do with the emergency program, is coordinate some of the resources that are available, both in response and recovery. So Dale is, he's timed out with us now. So this is his swan song journey. Going forward, by all means, if you've got issues, related to the fire recovery or other, type issues as you go forward. And I'm your principal point of contact with the TNRD operationally. So, through Jeffrey, you can get me, or, I'll leave some business cards here. I'm more than happy to take your calls and, work on individual problems as they come up. So tonight, we're really here to talk about the post-wildfire hazard assessment that was completed. So a normal process of events, we had the fire, bad things happen. We went through all of the stages of, emergency support services, evacuation, re-entry, and now we're back in spring and we're looking towards recovery. Part of this is looking at what the fire has done on the land base and some of the, legacy issues that are left over and some of the things we want to be aware of from an awareness point of view. And, I think Trevor and Carrie Ann can really speak to that process and what that looks like. But been through this a bunch of times. We, as a matter of course, get the reports, and it really specifically for the regional district residents, we're looking at threats to public safety, homes, infrastructure. So that's what we're going to do tonight, talk a little bit about what that process is. By all means, if you have questions, feel free to, interrupt, raise your hand. And I think it's on Carrie Ann's first slide. We're not talking about the fire response tonight. So we don't have BC Wildfire in the room to talk about what the response looks like. Tonight's agenda is really looking at what the impacts from the fire on the land base are and some of the things that people need to be aware of and look at. So I think we'll jump right in. Trevor, do you have a few words you'd like to speak? And I know we don't have a PA. We certainly, well, my wife is I've never heard from my wife. Can you please speak up? I'm sure you can all hear me, a nice small room here, but we are hopefully getting this audio recorded to go along with the presentation when we post it on the internet. So, I am holding the talking stick, but there is a point. So I'll pass that over to you, Trevor.
Yeah, so like Mike said, my name is Trevor Bohe, Director of All Hazard Response Coordination with the BC Ministry of Forests. Yeah, well, so my role in this case is to really oversee a program that we have our own geomorphologist, much like Carrie and her colleagues. That person isn't here right now, but in our case, Gareth Wells came out and did a preliminary assessment of this area after the fire and wrote what we call the level 2 post-wildfire natural hazard risk analysis report. And one of the recommendations of that report was that we do further study. These studies are quite in depth and require a little more person power than we have. The ministry, Gareth, being kind of an army of one in his area. So in this case, we put out a competitive bidding process, and Carrie Ann's firm, BGC, excellent firm, has done all kinds of work in this arena in the province and all over the world, won that bid, and they undertook the study starting in November and delivered that report, I think, January 2nd, and that's what we're here to talk about.
Okay. Yeah, I'm by trade, I also have a very large voice, but for equity, I also try and speak as much as I can into the mic as possible. And if folks don't want to ask questions on recording, I'm happy to take questions afterwards. There's going to be a lot of very personal things. And I think maybe, Mike, if we could, you might be my Vanna White tonight. If that's okay. So as you've heard, I've been in around this area quite a bit. I obviously have worked quite closely with Trisha on a number of different fire scars, and also BGC has been working in all of the fire scars in the area, in Ashcroft, in Cache Creek, in Lytton, in the Highway 8 area. So we've been in and around these fires for quite a number of years. So that's my context where I'm coming from. So I'm a geologist by trade, but I lean more on the side of landslides and floods and what happens after big wildfires. So what we're going to talk about tonight, I do want to give you a warning. This might be difficult or sensitive topics. I know that there has already been some flooding in the community, and some of the things we'll talk about may invoke memories of the fire. So just being aware of that. If you need to take a step out, please go for it. If it gets too warm in here, I might suggest we crack a window, because this also can be a very hefty topic to talk about as well. And I did see someone bring in sweets. I would highly recommend, if you're feeling overwhelmed, please grab one of those sweets or even a juice box. And you think I'm joking, but that's actually a really important thing, is that you feel overwhelmed. Take a break, go step out, have some sugar. As Mike said, we're not talking about the wildfire response. And then really importantly, this is a broad view of the fire scar. So it's not going to be really, really specific to your house. I've given some information about individual properties, but it doesn't give site-specific recommendations, for instance, where you might need to place mitigation or what you might need to do in the case of a rebuild that might be required by local government authorities. So overview still, but enough information to kind of have the community understand what the potential threats are after the fire. We can go forward. And one more. So as you're all very aware of, the slopes within a number of the different valleys in the area, so Venables, Twall, and Murray Creek, were all burned in the Shetland Creek fire. These are some of the drone photos that we took last November when we were in the valley. It was a really gorgeous day, and then it snowed on our last day in here. And it's been like that since, and I'm really excited to kind of see the green up and what's been happening. So all of the slopes burned very severely. And I'll talk a little bit about burn severity and what that looks like in the end. But when I look at this landscape, the thing I'm looking at is these kind of what I call matchstick or candlewick trees, where you've got very, very black trees. And that's an area that typically would produce this kind of post-wildfire response that I'll talk about. But when I look at the landscape, those are the things that I'm looking out for in these images. And I've got some posters and info cards you can take on the way out afterwards. But one of the things that we know about following a major wildfire is that geohazards like debris flows, debris floods, landslides, they all occur more frequently, and they tend to also be bigger than normal after a wildfire. And what I'll talk about a little bit later is you might be used to seeing small mudslides, I don't know, when you drive down the highway and it's a heavy rainfall, you might be seeing some tiny little, muddy flows coming down the channel. After a wildfire, those tiny little muddy flows aren't like that anymore. And a picture that I'll show a bit later, there's some of the biggest debris flows that we see in interior BC happen after these major wildfires. These infographics that I'll give you at the end here as well also talk a little bit about what you can do from a response perspective in the event that something does happen. And some very important key takeaways here about if you hear or see something happening. And I was in the school earlier today talking to the kids and kind of driving home the message that if you hear or see something happening that's weird, like you hear big rumbling, you hear trees coming down the hill, you see trees shaking, you need to get to the highest point as quickly as possible. Preferably that's in a house, on the highest floor and the furthest away from the mountainside. If you can run as fast as you can, someplace like the hill behind here, up onto a place that's a little bit higher ground, those are the places that you need to go. So that's the most important thing. If you think about nothing else I'm going to tell you tonight, that's the most important part. You can't outrun these things. You can't drive through these things. You need to get into someplace safe in the event that they do happen. And the reason why I'm telling you this now is I want you to think about that. And I'll show a video here in a second, but these can occur within 2 minutes of heavy rainfall occurring. So the rain's happening up on the mountainside, and in 2 minutes, there's a debris flow coming down here. There's very little warning between when they happen. So Mike's gonna bring up a video here. And this video is how many folks have driven Highway 8 after the Lytton fire? Okay, so a few of you. So this is a video that's been provided by one of the community members along Highway 8. If you know where FX Ranch is, this is one of the houses at FX Ranch. And it's going to cycle through the video a couple times here. We'll kind of replay it afterwards. But this is a shop video that was taken. He's backing out his truck in the morning. And then later in the afternoon, his shop camera gets triggered by the debris flow going through the yard. This, for context, those logs that are traveling through there are about 10 or 15 meters tall. And this is the smaller of the two flows that went through the yard at that time. The splash marks on near the house that's kind of behind the frame here were up to 3 meters high on some of the trees. So these are very, very fast and they can occur very quickly. You can't outrun them. So that's not, and again, I'm not trying to scare you, but I want to make you aware that after a wildfire, these are the things that can happen. And so that's why we come into community to inform you, to equip you, to try and understand what you might need to do or be aware of those risks. We'll skip to the next one there. So as I mentioned, we've been working in the area quite a bit. I've been working on mapping the Venables Valley at a very high scale since 2018, doing some initial mapping. And then we were employed by Ministry of Forests to come do the detailed post-wildfire assessment. So what we try and do during this assessment, we're looking at the watersheds, so how they might be affected by these geohazards after the fire. So looking at debris flows, debris floods, and landslides. As Mike emphasized, we're looking at life safety risks. For the most part, we're prioritizing life safety risks to people in buildings. We do care, I personally do care, and I know agriculture particularly has a very important effect on people's livelihoods, but for the most part, we're trying to emphasize the life safety risks. And then providing some conceptual recommendations for what you might be able to do to reduce those risks. So what have you got? You've got a very large report, and I apologize, I am the cause of that very large report, but there's a lot of science that has to be done for documentation, for legal purposes. I have to describe everything that I've done so that somebody could essentially redo the work that I've done. So you've got a big giant report. The things I want you to focus on, 2 things. So there's a series of maps. You can take a copy of those maps as you go out the door. So there's copies of the maps. There's also copies of the maps in much larger form that they were meant to be viewed at in the back. And then you've got these summary sheets, which are for each individual watershed, which are more about the specific properties and house numbers. So in that big giant document that you all saw, those are the 2 things you're going to want to go to understand what the risks would be to your potential properties. So you can either see it visually, or you can see all the different components of it. So I'll talk a little bit about what we do for the assessment process. and then some high level understanding of what you need to kind of read through with that. So as a scientist, what I do is I answer a series of questions. And what this is talking about, and kind of what Trevor alluded to in the beginning, is I'm going to talk about something called partial risk. So partial risk is basically asking how likely is an event going to happen, and how likely is it to affect that thing that we care about. So what are the chances that a post-wildfire debris flow is going to happen, and what are the chances it's going to get to the particular house? So that's my ultimate goal. And I'm trying to describe that with some math, some statistics, some evidence from other wildfires. That's essentially what I try and do. So I ask these questions. How badly did the watershed burn? What's the chance that it changed the geohazards? How long until the watershed recovers from the fire? And then we'll talk a little bit about alluvial fans because they're really important in this area. So what kind of geohazards would reach the fan? What areas of the fan are most impacted? And then where are the houses and other things we care about on the fan itself? And you'll kind of see these terms throughout the report. That first kind of series of questions, post-wildfire hazard likelihood. So what's the chance it's going to happen? And then what's the chance it's going to reach something we care about afterwards? So to kind of answer that first question of how likely is it? So what we've done is we've created what's called a burn severity map. So in the beginning there, what I was talking about are those kind of candlestick looking or candle wick looking trees. Those are very high burn severity. And I've got some photographs if anybody's interested. We were talking about this earlier in the school, is the wildfire changes the soil. It actually burns. Normally the soil in this area is about this thick and it's full of organics material, old trees, leaf litter, and it's all kind of decomposed. That layer is now about this thick. So the fire in those areas where the trees are black has essentially removed that entire layer, and it's left a tiny little bit of ash on top. So in those areas, we would expect to see, instead of rain kind of falling on the trees and absorbing some of the water that comes from the rainfall, the rain actually goes straight down. And in some cases, it can actually go straight to the creek. So there's no absorption left in the soil in those places. So the map that you're going to see there in the back on the left is what we call a burn severity map. So areas of red, and just to give everyone kind of an orientation of what that map is, I don't know if anybody in the back there is familiar with the geography of the area, could maybe stand up and kind of show where the Venables Valley is. Those two lakes there. So those watersheds, you'll kind of notice just to the left of where the lakes are, you'll see that they're almost all entirely red. So that means that, and you know this, you've kind of looked around, almost all of those watersheds have a very high degree of high burn severity. You can then get into these kind of lower classes, moderate and low. So what those look like is maybe the trees are kind of orange looking, or the trees don't have any kind of needle change at all on them. Those areas don't produce as much of a post-wildfire response. So what I try and emphasize is how much of the area has burned really, really badly. We also do some other things. So we do some desktop assessments. We think about, is this going to produce a debris flow or debris flood, which is just one's runnier and one's thicker. Debris flows are kind of like concrete moving down a hill at the speed of a car. Debris floods are more like watery, muddy water that can transport like kind of this size rocks in the water. So debris flows kind of behave a little differently. They're a bit more destructive. And so we think about what's the chances it's going to produce one of those events. And then going out to do a bunch of field work to map those areas as well. So the thing that I care about the most in terms of post-wildfire debris flows is called an alluvial fan. And you notice that if you drive around in community, the road kind of goes up and down very gently. So most of the community is on what are called these alluvial fans. There's sediment that's come out of the watersheds that's been deposited over the last 10,000 years, and it creates these really beautiful landforms, where most of the houses are on the community. So I've mapped all those out from aerial images that were taken over the last 40 years and kind of delineated where those might be. So those are the places that are most likely to see post-wildfire effects. There are some areas in the community that have things like rockfall hazards as well. And I can talk about those a little bit afterwards, but this is the main thing that I'm looking at is where are those alluvial fans? Next one. And then one of the last things that I do is I think about how big these post-wildfire debris flows could be. And what I want you to think a little bit about is, or kind of my rule of thumb, is that generally if it's a bigger debris flow, they're going to be deeper and faster and a higher risk to life. So a tiny little debris flow, this is an example from the White Rock Lake fire near Monty Lake in 2021. So this is about 500 cubic meters of sediment. So that might just put a little skiff of dirt across the floor here. You can see in this image that picnic table hasn't moved. So there's very little water, very little sediment that's come through here. This might go into a basement, a crawl space, probably result in some economic damages for that person that lives there in that community. The example in the middle here, this is the Lytton Creek fire, and this is about 1,000 cubic meter debris flow. That sediment is all the way up to the runners of the truck. So it hasn't moved the truck, but it's about up to the runners of the truck. If you were trying to walk through this at the time that it was happening, you very likely could not walk through it. And in fact, you would probably be taken off of your feet by the time it's going through there. So this is where we begin to approach kind of threatening lives. And in the far right example, you can't see it very much, or I'm going to point it out, but that's a truck for scale in the middle of that photo on Highway 8. So this is 100,000 cubic meter debris flow, so very, very large. And that video that I showed you there earlier from the shop is just kind of off screen here, is where that location went through. So in this case, those trees, we had splash marks up to about 3 meters high, and it was kind of moving through about up to my chest. So when we get bigger events, faster, deeper flows, the more likely it is to go all the way across the alluvial fan. So those are the kind of things I think about when I do this assessment, and I go through and I kind of think about what are the chances it might happen, what are the chances it might go. Next one. So all of this gets put into a very sciencey matrix, but it's just a way for us to be able to assess things in the same procedure over and over. So the matrix that you're seeing here on the left is what we call our partial risk rating, and it ranges from very low to very high. I hope everybody can kind of see the colors. I'm trying to make color schemes a little bit better for color blindness. But very low just kind of means there's a chance it probably won't happen, or it probably won't reach something we care about. Very high is there's a very high chance it's going to happen and it's going to reach something we care about. The definitions that you can see there for both the hazard likelihood and the spatial impact likelihood are provided there, but I'll just highlight a couple. So anything that's got a high or very high likelihood has a greater than 1% chance of happening in the next 5 years, so annual likelihood. You can kind of think of this like a flood. So this is about equivalent to saying, you know, there's a chance it's a 1 in 100 year event, but in some cases, if you're in the very high category, there's about a 10, maybe 20% chance, or even higher than that it could occur in a given year. Now that sounds very low, but on average, the events of this size that occur in this area that result in threats to life are more like in the 0.1 or 0.0001, like many, many orders of magnitude smaller chance that it normally occurs in this area. So after a wildfire, they become much more likely. And then we've got the chance that it's going to hit something that we care about. So low, moderate, and high categories. So as I mentioned, we've summarized all the results for each watershed and property onto these sheets. And I'm going to walk you through what you want to take notice of on these sheets. So we'll go to the next one here. So what you'll see is, you'll see kind of the hazard information. So it'll talk about which fan we've mapped, what's the watershed. You can actually, if you feel very, very curious, you can go into another report, see what's the percentage of burn in each of those catchments. The creek name. Here's all the information about the burn severity. So if it's unburned, low, moderate, and high. So in this case, this watershed 38, only 2% is unburned, 4% is low burn, 20% is kind of orange trees, moderate. 73% is candle wicks. So a very, very high amount of that watershed has burned kind of to black candlesticks. I've assessed that that's a debris flow potential in a post-fire scenario, and it's likely that that debris flow is going to be greater than 10,000 cubic meters if it does occur. So in this case, I've given that rating a very high geohazard likelihood. The next thing you'll have is about what's the thing I'm looking at, what's the thing we care about. So as much as I can, and eternal gratitude to Mike and others at TNRD and within the community for helping me figure out which is a building and which wasn't, or what we could figure out was building or not. I apologize if I didn't include your house as the correct location. Did the best I could. Tried to walk around as much as we could, but we couldn't obviously get every single thing. So we've got what is the identifier? If we could, we gave it the proper address number, but in some cases we found buildings didn't have address numbers. What it is, so if it's a building or if it's a water source. And then we've got the information about how we assess what's the chance it would hit a building or that thing in the event of a debris flow. So these cases we've got moderate, so 10 to 50% chance, and then greater than 50% chance it would be hit during that event. And then the last thing is this partial risk rating, which combines those two things, the likelihood and the spatial impact rating, to give you that partial risk very high rating. And then those are what the categories that you're going to see shown on the maps and throughout the room is for each house. We've given that rating of very to low to very high if it would be affected by a post-wildfire event. So this is kind of zoom in. Again, the maps are available there or maps on the back. So you can look at it in these either maps or in those appendices is that you can see all the buildings are color coded, very high, high, moderate, or not in a hazard impact area. And you can see where all of those different buildings are across the valley itself. So you can see that there's a large chunk of them in the community. And we're actually sitting in one of the buildings right here that's in that very high partial risk category. So this is the results for all of the buildings across the fire scar. These are almost entirely in the Venables Valley. There's only one structure that's located off Venables Valley at Hilltop Gardens. So you can kind of roughly think that this is how many buildings are affected in the community itself. So we have 20 buildings that are at very high partial risk. I think one of those includes the campground. Don't remember that exact number, but anyways, about 20 buildings are very high, 21 high, and 2 moderate. And for context, these, if I was looking at this outside of a wildfire hazard, so I work in communities like District of North Vancouver that have landslide risk assessment policies that say whether or not you can build a building in certain areas. Houses in this high to very high chance of an event occurring and hitting a building and potentially resulting in a life safety threat, so somebody losing their life, are about 10 to 100 times that tolerance criteria in District of North Vancouver. So it's very, I'm not talking about this is a chance, I'm talking about this is a very high chance of this happening, much higher than it would normally be. Now, I do want to give you this caveat. There's a chance it couldn't happen. In fact, there's more of a chance that it doesn't happen at all. But what we come to tell you is that there's a much higher chance than it used to be. And that's something you need to be aware of. So in some fires, absolutely nothing happens. The watershed recovers really quick. Nothing happens at all. Everything regrows. I know that Trevor's working on a fire scar over in the Shuswap, which thankfully hasn't really had any big events. I've also worked on the fire over here and over here that's produced over 1,000 different events over the last 5 years. So we don't know. We don't have a ton of information, but what we know is based on the fires nearby, we know that there's just a very high chance that they could occur following a fire of this severity in this area. So partial risk is the chance it happens and the chance it hits a house. Is basically those two things together is what we call high partial risk. If we were to go, and I'm not saying everybody should do this, But what we tend to do in other communities is we do what we call a full quantitative risk assessment, where we go, what's the chance it happens? We actually model that debris flow with a computer model. We look at the characteristics of the flow, we look at how it interacts with the house, and we estimate what are the chances of a fatality occurring because of that. So that's where we get all these like really hard numbers where it says in District of North Vancouver, for instance, their tolerance line for whether or not they would allow development is a 1 in 10,000 annual chance of somebody dying from a landslide in that location. In a post-fire scenario, under these, we're way above that. We're looking at, and I don't know the exact numbers because this isn't a full quantitative risk assessment, but we're more looking at a 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 100 or 1 in 10 chance, depending on where the house is. So we're much, much higher into the likelihood of that occurring following a wildfire. Does that help? Yeah, the partial risk is mostly because when you do a risk assessment, you actually go all the way to the estimation of the consequences. Partial risk is only saying the event occurs and it reaches something. We don't go to the full detail of actually evaluating those consequences. But doing that is a much more prolonged process. And we try and do these as quickly as we can to get the information here. I'm just giving you some context of other locations in Canada where I've seen this, kind of to compare what it would mean for other jurisdictions. And I should clarify with Mike, but Thompson-Nicola Regional District does not have those jurisdictions. This is more to give you a comparison of what other places have thought about this a little bit. Yeah.
We're going to talk about 5 years, so do most events happen within a 5-year period?
Yeah. So most post-wildfire events happen in the first 2 to 3 years following the fire, which is when the ground, you're missing all those trees, but the ground also has, in some cases, what's called a hydrophobic or water repellent soil in it. So that first 2 to 3 years is really critical, where the rain will fall straight onto the ground and it could potentially run off very quickly. The watersheds in this area have taken somewhere between 3 to 5 years to recover from a wildfire. The only asterisk I'll place on that is that what I have seen on these fire scars all the way from Lytton up through here is that the recovery isn't really conifers that's coming back. What's coming back is grass. And so there's a chance that you'll probably get some changes in the floods that are going to happen for several decades. So not the debris flows. So you'll see those kind of slowly, gradually disappear over time. But the water is going to behave very differently for quite a while until the watershed recovers, either naturally or through what we call managed recovery, which is reforestation, replanting, all those other pieces, aerial reseeding, those different pieces. So for the most part, it's this kind of 2, 3, 5 year-ish window that we get the most concerned about. Yeah. Yep.
We have done it in the past, and we don't do it everywhere. I guess the science doesn't fully support that reseeding. Has 100% chance or even a high percent chance of stopping one of these events. We've seen areas that have been reseeded still generate debris flows and debris floods. And we've seen a lot of natural green up on its own. In fact, we look at areas that we have reseeded. It looked the same as areas, even this area driving through the year after, you don't see much of a difference. So we're not really seeing that we're vastly enhancing the green up by aerial seeding. And we have had situations where we have done aerial seeding in the past and it's still generated a flow. So yeah, at this point, we're not planning on doing any aerial reseeding of any areas. And that's always, that could be subject to change if there was a really compelling argument to do so. But in this case, what I've heard is through the forest district, we're looking at some areas for replanting, and I don't know exactly which fans, which slopes, which areas, but it is being assessed right now for potential replanting. And now we never replant the entire area that's burned. We've seen some areas get up to 40% replanted, which is sort of a high percentage, and other areas will get less, some will get none. But I spoke with the district this morning, and they're doing an assessment. They haven't completely colored in the areas in the map that are going to get done, but there will be some. It's determined by areas where they think it'll be successful. So you're not going to reforest areas that are too steep to plant. Yeah, and they just have to be in they're the highest area of success, really. Yeah.
Is there anything specific that the government can do specifically in terms of watershed recovery to assist or to enhance watershed recovery?
I think yeah, I mean, I think the best thing really can be reforestation. Now, obviously reforestation works best after salvage logging. You can go in and plant trees in amongst burned areas, but it's really difficult and it's not very efficient. The trees that are left behind generate too much shade for some of the species that get planted. So yeah, so I mean that's generally the way it works. Is you would look at an area that could benefit from salvage logging, and then there's a requirement to replant those areas afterwards.
Maybe I'm getting completely off topic, but on the note of salvage logging, what impact does that have on slope stability, and how will that impact us at the bottom of the slope who are already in a very high risk area?
Yeah, I mean, it has to be carefully considered. So if an area, if an area was considered, so anytime logging is done currently, I'm not talking about 20, 30 years ago when practices were not to the standard they are today, but nowadays there has to be a terrain assessment done before any logging takes place. So if you're in an area where the terrain assessment, say it hadn't burned, wouldn't support logging, we're certainly not now going to go in and take those trees because they burned, because it'll just make things worse. So, I mean, that is part of the consideration as well. So when we talk about areas that are chosen for this type of activity, you have to, the logging company would have to have a terrain assessment done. They'd have access to Carrie Ann's report, our report, and they can't make things worse, essentially.
Okay. I'm only going to be about 5 more minutes. So I'm happy to take questions afterwards if folks need a bio break or anything of that piece. So let's talk about risk reduction options. So there's not a lot, but I want you to be aware that there are things that you can do to reduce risk. The most important part being, as kind of Trevor mentioned earlier, and as kind of been alluding to, it's a very narrow window that these hazards happen, and they tend to happen really quickly after a fire. So for context, I know somebody that works in Jasper National Park, and for instance, they've already had post-wildfire debris flows happen in Jasper before the community got back into Jasper. So that was a big rainstorm that happened in Jasper locally before the community even got back. It didn't affect anything in the community, but obviously a different part of the community. So they can happen very fast after it. In this part of the world, we tend to see them happen somewhere between May and September with heavy rainfall events. So that's not a lot of time. That's not a lot of time between now and then. So in that light, getting out of the way before an event occurs is the only option that will completely eliminate risks. It's the only option that's going to reduce everything. There are options that you can do. So one of the things that we talk about is being aware. So having this information given to you, making sure you're aware that the conditions that often produce these events, so heavy, intense rainfall is typically what happens. When I was talking with the students earlier, I was getting them to kind of slap their knees. So it has to be very, very intense rainfall. They happen in short bursts typically. But every once in a while, we do get an atmospheric river that sneaks all the way over here. So it's not out of the question, but they tend to happen most often during intense rainstorms. So the other piece is act. And I think we were talking earlier about, emergency preparedness. So making sure you're prepared to act before a storm, know the actions to take during a storm. And I kind of talked about this a little bit earlier, but packing things like a grab and go bag. And I'll talk a little bit about where you should go in the event that you see something happen. And then there's the other last thing, which is mitigate. So constructing something to reduce the risks. And I'll go through a couple examples of what those might look like on properties. Now I'm going to caveat that with mitigation is private property, and there is generally no funding available from province or the feds to actually do that mitigation. So if you choose to do that last piece, for the most part, that's done on your own dime. So doing that, and those can be quite costly. So just kind of take that into consideration. This should be a last resort if you have it available to you. These are the really important parts to know before that actually happens. Yes. Yep.
So what do we do if we're right in the path of it?
I will get to that. Yeah, I'm going to get to that because that's a really important part. So the first one is being aware. So knowing the weather conditions around you. And I've talked to many of you and I've talked to many of your kids or your grandkids. They are all very, very smart. You're all very, very observant about this valley. So knowing what the weather conditions are around you. I will make sure that you know, though, that this area and this valley in particular, if you're trying to look at radar data and trying to figure out if there's a really intense storm coming here, your nearest radar station, does anybody actually know where the nearest radar station is? Yeah, the weather. How do you know? Oregon Jack, but how do you know the radar? How do you know what's actually happening right here, right now? Look out your window because the nearest radar station is in Vernon. And then Abbotsford. So this valley is not in the line of sight for radar. So if you're trying to monitor it, trying to get a hold of it, you don't see this valley in the radar data. It is something we're talking about with Environment Canada, but it's probably not going to happen anytime soon. This valley, if you're trying to monitor the weather, you can't see this valley in the radar data. And remember what I said earlier about it only takes a minute or two for the rain to fall and the debris flow to happen. So don't also be thinking about, I'm going to watch and see what happens in Ashcroft, because by the time you see what happens there, it's already happened. So stay informed. So watch the weather, be aware of the weather. I don't want you to be worried about it constantly, but be watching out for intense rainstorms. Be watching out for those big clouds building in the sky. Be thinking about that thunderstorms. Those are going to happen. I'm going to come back to this can I come back to it in a second, Trevor? Let me get through this and then I'll go back to questions. Prepare a plan. Know where you need to go. We'll talk a little bit about that. Prepare your emergency kit for your home, your workplace. Make sure everybody has a plan where you're going to meet afterwards, during an event, things like that. Where are the safest places that you have in the houses or locations you're in? And then knowing the signs. If you see the rumbling, if you hear the rumbling, if you see trees shaking, that kind of thing, you should know that those are signs that there is a landslide happening, and you should know where to go in the event that that is happening. Yes.
Know what weather predictions like, and it's not fantastic. We all make jokes about the weatherman, but and for these little squalls that come up sort of quickly and can generate these type of events, I don't think really anyone's any good at predicting those. But when we talk about some of the bigger events like the atmospheric rivers, we do get fairly good advance warning of those forming and kind of where they're going to move in a wide path, and we get those from Environment Canada. And then what happens is that information gets relayed to the province, through the River Forecast Center. If it looks like it's going to be dire, then we typically have a coordination call with EMBC, EMCR, with the local government. So at that point, if we're all hearing about an event that's going to be big enough that we're all worried about it, there's going to be a coordination call that the province is going to have with the TNRD. Mike and his colleagues will be aware of it, and then they'll be enacting their emergency plans.
That though, because all of a sudden there it was.
last summer. So, and everyone seemed to think everything was fine and this is what we were going to be living with for the next few months. And then boom, it was like, you got to go now. So you can see where I feel a little hesitant as to whether or not.
Yeah, you know, you just sort of get put on alert. Like we hear about these things usually 72 hours in advance. The information gets better about 40 hours out, and it gets, you know, much better as we kind of count down in sort of 6 hour intervals. So at that point, you know, the community would be working with your community leaders. The TNRD would be. So if I'm speaking too much for you, Mike, you jump in. You know, but I'm just saying, like, I don't want you to feel like you're going to be completely on your own. If it's a big enough weather event that provincially we're having coordination calls about it, then your local government would be working with you, right? And we're not saying that you're going to have up to the second information on if something's going to hit and when it's going to hit, but you at least be kind of put on alert or notice and being told to watch out and be vigilant and you know, maybe even consider whether you want to you know, make that choice to go somewhere else for the weekend, right?
Would that be like a voyant alert or?
That would be a question.
So yeah, in the case of, you know, as Trevor was describing, you know, potential atmospheric river or, you know, a very significant weather system moving into the area, if we get notification that it's going to be significant, certainly Voyant Alert would be one of the tools that we'd be looking at. You know, and it's just a weather event coming into BC would not normally um, prompt us to do some sort of a Voyant Alert. Knowing the reality of, you know, the land base in the Venables Valley, we would take that into consideration and think, okay, is this appropriate? So, you know, does everybody know Voyant Alert? You know, awesome. I mean, probably one of the greatest uptakes we have in a community with Voyant Alert. So that is certainly a really good spot to go for information. That'll be pushed out to you. But you know, our social media feeds too. You know, so subscribe to, you know, the TNRD's social media feeds, and you know, because we'll start populating advisories there well before we get to the place where we're issuing a Voyant Alert. You know, if there's significant weather systems coming in, you know, if there's a high stream flow advisory, we amplify those messages on our social media. So by all means, subscribe and follow those pages, and then you can, you know, get a little bit of heads up and know what we know as we know it. We don't keep anything internal to us. We're pretty much an open book when it comes to information sharing. So as soon as we hear, we try to propagate that information out. But, you know, with weather events, given the bullseyes on those are usually pretty broad, it's very difficult to directly notify who's being impacted because, well, until it happens, we don't know. And, you know, that was really the reality in the atmospheric river. Um, the, the notification there wasn't really, there was an awful lot of shock and awe from that event. So that's the nature of weather.
I wanted to ask also about the snow is melting. So typically, like on our property, there's about 90% of the trees that are sticks. So we've done some logging of it, but every springtime, the water comes down, and whatever it does, it's got two roots, and it comes down, it comes past my house. And that can happen just if there's a big melt or something. So if there's a big melt and then there's a storm and a lot of rain, I mean, we had some pretty good downpour a little while ago. So I'm outside making little ditches. So I don't know what kind of mitigation there is for that.
Talk about that in a second. The other piece there, I just wanted to comment on Mike's piece, because I'm often the one Environment Canada is calling, trying to figure out what exactly is going to happen in that event. We don't actually have a lot of like thresholds in Canada to try and figure out when these things happen. But the other thing to be aware of is Environment Canada does have things like thunderstorm watch, thunderstorm warnings, thunderstorm alerts. So also being aware that those things do exist. As I mentioned, there's no radar here, so we can't see exactly what's happening right here. But the computer models are telling them about the chances of intense rainfall happening with the atmospheric conditions during that. So often these are big swaths of areas. They might say, okay, between Cache Creek and Lillooet and Spence's Bridge, there's a chance tomorrow that you might get an intense rainstorm occurring from a thunderstorm. That's a huge area, but that's the reality of what the kind of computer models say. And then what you should be aware of is that day or the next day, thinking about, okay, watch those thunderstorms. Watch where they are in the area, be thinking about where they're going and that kind of stuff. So there are things you can do to be watch about it, but also take care of yourself. If you're finding that you're really getting fatigued about it, talk to somebody about that. There's lots of folks that I've talked to in the Nicola Valley and in other places. They're just like, I'm tired of watching the thunderstorms. So be careful, be vigilant of that. And the other thing to note is there's a chance nothing is going to happen. And then you're going to kind of get fatigued about these events. So just be careful, be thinking about it, do what you can, but there is a chance that nothing will happen at all, which is a good thing. But we want to be aware of that and what's going on in your state.
Last time we have, it was during the nighttime.
Yes.
So that's another issue now. You're sleeping and that happening. So what to do at that point?
Yeah. Okay. So let me go to the next one, because this is the most important part. So kind of what I alluded to in the beginning. So if you hear or see something happen, so if there's a chance something is happening right now, and if you're awake to hear it or you wake up and hear it, things like that. This is all born out of, and this is going to sound really clinical for a second. This is born out of research in places where we have done detailed work and know exactly how many people were in a landslide zone before it happened and how many fatalities resulted during that landslide. So this is all born out of the decisions that people make in the event of a landslide happening makes more of a difference than anything else. So knowing what to do, knowing the chance that you're going to live through an event, these are the most important things to take away. So if you have a clear and present path to be able to get to it in less than a minute, take that path. So that's step one. So if you're sitting in this building and you can see that hill behind you and know that this building is in a debris flow path, you go to that hill, but you better be able to run to that hill in less than a minute. And it shouldn't be when the wall of water is coming down here. If you can run to there, that's where you should go. You're not going to get in your vehicle and drive. You're not going to try and grab your go bag and go. You try and go as quickly as you can to a place that you know is safe. If you can't get to a safe location, you go up in a building as high as possible. Preferably a second floor, an above ground floor. If you have really easy access to a roof, try and go up as high as physically possible in your house. You also go as far away from the mountainside in your house as possible. So you're trying to go away from the mountainside and up as high as possible. If that's your last resort, sit on the top of the house. Yeah, if you can't get up easily into something, if your house is at ground floor and it's a single story and you can jump on the roof really quickly, go for it. But if you got to go down, get a ladder to climb up on the roof, don't do that. That's not the thing you do. These are things you do in under a minute. It does. So unfortunately, the type of house matters in a landslide. But more importantly, what matters is where are the windows in relation to the slide that comes in. So in this case, so let's pretend for a second, these windows are facing mountainside. It's a really nice view, right? But they're also sitting about a meter and a half above the ground. So unless it's a really big landslide, they're probably not going to come in through the windows. But what I see is folks, particularly more in the city, not necessarily out in the country, is that folks that have basement floors also have entry windows at ground level. And if you have a bedroom in the basement, that's a really bad scenario because the debris will come in the window and go into the bedroom. So the best thing is, yes, it matters what kind of house you're in. So generally, Wood frame structures are going to be more resistant than a mobile home structure is to the kind of impact forces that are faced during a landslide. For context, about a meter flow is about the minimum depth that's required to sustain building damage. So anything less than that generally does not damage buildings to a large extent. Still causes economic damage, but it doesn't cause structural damage. Once you start getting above that point, that's when we start worrying about structural damage to a house, and it can actually collapse the house itself. So the pressure that's actually coming on the building. That's why I'm telling you, get away from the mountainside and get up as high as you can, because if the landslide hits the side of the house, you want to be away from that wall as much as you can. So knowing that, one of the things that you can think about is if you do have a bedroom or a place that you're sleeping and you're unconscious for, well, you all look like somewhat retired folks, so you probably sleep more than I do, or maybe you don't, I don't know, is you might be there for several hours of the day. So if you do have a bedroom that is mountain facing on a lower level, you might consider moving that bedroom temporarily during this kind of elevated period to be able to get away from those higher risk zones in your house. So the next part is, okay, so if you go up as high as you can. The next part is you're climbing on top of furniture if you can, again, and getting yourself higher. And then the last part is also, and I was teaching the kids earlier, is doing the kind of hugging your knee situation. Once that event stops, you do not leave that physical structure of the house, because there's a chance more is going to happen, more is going to come. You don't want to be outside. You are safer in a building, you are safer in a car than your soft, squishy body is against the rocks and trees outside. So you don't leave there until somebody comes to get you. The other piece about debris flows is that if you try and walk across them, you will sink immediately. They are soft, they are very squishy, and they do not have a lot of strength. So if you try and cross an area, you're probably going to get caught in it as well. So stay in whatever structure you have until help comes. Questions on that?
One thing I can get from the report is in terms of the very high risk areas, there is a feature of a landslide that is different than what you're characterizing, particularly like large blocks.
Yeah. So further down there. Yeah. Yeah. And so I can talk about that a little bit. So rock falls are a bit of a weird one. We don't actually see, thankfully, we don't see a ton of post-wildfire rock falls. Generally, they happen the first freeze-thaw cycle after a major wildfire or during the wildfire itself. There's still a chance that they could happen, but they're not nearly as widespread or destructive as the debris flows are. But there still is a chance of a rockfall occurring. This kind of adage of all the stuff I'm telling you is just so much more nuanced with the way rockfall works. Like a rock will bounce on the ground and all of a sudden take a 90-degree turn if it's big enough. And so it's harder to say like, you know, don't be right next to the channel in the event of a rockfall because they just have this chaotic nature to them. The biggest thing that I get people to think about is if your house has a giant rock beside it, there's probably a reason that rock is there, and it's because a rockfall has happened in the past. So just be thinking about that in terms of that. And there are ways you can engineer and design all of that, but in general, kind of things to think about, like don't have the bedrooms on the upslope side or the mountain slope side. All those kind of things are still very valid from that regard. Does that help? No. This area is generally more in the debris flow and debris slide realm. The rockfall risks are actually closer to the south end of the valley that I could see, where there's bare rock and cliffs. There are a couple locations, but it's more widespread in the south part. Okay, and then the last part here, if you see something weird or you notice it, the first thing you're gonna do, if you're safe, you're gonna report that event to this 1-800 number. This is BC Emergency Management and Climate Readiness. This is a 24/7, or you call Mike. Mike would prefer me to say you call this number first, and then you call him.
Mike isn't 24/7. 24/7 staff. But that 800 number is your best answer because guaranteed there's someone answering that phone 24/7. And they can track down me or Kevin or Jamie or someone else inside the TNRD.
Or 911. If it's a really significant thing that's happening, you call 911. But if it's debris on the road, like you can see in this picture, this is actually Savannah from last year. That's not post-fire, but this is Savannah from last year. That was 100 millimeters of rainfall in like an hour or something like that. I don't think that's an exact number. I don't agree with that number, but anyways, a lot of rain fell very fast in Savannah and went through there, but it happened. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, wow. Okay. Before the fire, I was going to say, okay. Anyways, but yeah. So call this number, or if you need to, call 911 and then you call TNRD, Emergency Services. Okay. I think that's my last slide. Oh, okay. And then mitigation. So the last part about it is, so if you have the resources to be able to do this on your property, what can you do to structurally mitigate this piece? With the caveat that I've kind of noted here. So digging a ditch yourself, well, I would love to say that's the thing to do. You don't know a lot about how deep or fast those debris flows could be in that location. And so it is always best if those are designed by qualified professionals. So folks like myself, geotechnical engineers, people who can understand how big something needs to be in order to protect you from safety. Because the thing that I don't want is people going out with an excavator, piling up a little bit of a berm and saying I'm safe, and making that berm this big when the debris flow is this big. Okay, so just be really careful about, if you do choose to do that on your own, being really careful about how you do that on your own. So they should be designed by a qualified professional. The options that are available, all of these extremely expensive, but I'm just giving you them for ideas as to what that looks like. This is called fan level conveyance, where you basically dig out the entire channel and then you make it much bigger and wider. This is the municipality of Canmore following their big flood in 2013. The second one that you can do is fan level debris deflection structures, where you capture the sediment. So this is a big catchment structure down in the United States, where it basically just captures the debris before it goes through the community. That's another thing you can do. And then there's some other pieces about the building level risk reduction. So designing little blocks or walls, kind of engineered retaining walls that go around a structure, deflection berms actually around the house itself. The thing that you should be aware of is, if you do that on your house, make sure that you're not pushing the debris onto your neighbor's house. Be really careful, again, where you should be getting somebody to design these things. And then the one piece that I kind of mentioned there, that safe home design, is like, put your bedrooms up high and away from the slope, at least temporarily. Okay, last slide. So closing takeaways. The geohazards were here before the fire, but they're more likely and they're potentially bigger after the fire. We should go back to pre-wildfire levels when the vegetation reestablishes. So after the sediment flushes out of the system, or when the vegetation comes back somewhere 2 to 5 years after the fire. If it's just grasses that come back, you might still get flooding problems for many, many years or decades. Very small amounts of rainfall could trigger debris flows. An event that used to not trigger anything could all of a sudden cause a really big problem. Generally, what I say is, if, like, when you know, when your windshield wipers, you know how you've got like different settings? If you're on like the highest setting, or like the just below the highest setting, that's problematic zone. If you're on like level 1, not as bad. But if you're like cranking the windshield wiper and it goes all the way to the bottom and you still can't see, problematic. Okay. Has to be usually very intense rainfall, but it doesn't have to take that super intense rainfall. It also, that video that I showed earlier with the one that's going through the shop, somebody was standing on the opposite valley watching that storm hit, did not get a single drop of rain over him, and watched the entire landslide happen and hit his house across the valley. So they can be very, very isolated storms that can happen. Be aware of the risks, make a plan. Don't wait to evacuate until you hear or see. So if you want to leave, please do ahead of it. And then if something does happen, you go to a safe location, preferably in a building, or if not, onto an area of higher topography. And then avoidance is the only 100% effective risk reduction. Okay, that's it. As I mentioned, I've got a bunch of stuff you can take away with you. I've got all those kind of key messages are all in the infographics. There's copies of maps that are available there if you want to take those as you go. There's also maps at the back if you want to kind of see them in bigger detail that they're printed out at. I'm going to say we'll probably take 1 or 2 more questions and then turn the mic off if folks want to ask questions off mic. But is there anything else, Mike, Trevor, anybody else wants to say before we kind of close this off?
Just a reminder that the complete report is.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Those like appendices where each specific property goes through all the partial risk results for each specific property. It's got all your addresses. That's on the TNRD website. I couldn't print out copies of all of those. So yes, that is there.
Just have one more question.
Yeah.
Just thinking in terms of the LiDAR, and that hasn't factored into the whole vast geotech assessment. But on page 3 of your report, it says this report is of insufficient detail to provide individual property owners a geotechnical assessment that may be required by First Nations and local governments as part of their permitting. So should we expect a more fulsome assessment later on that we can?
No. So this is the tricky part. So, and maybe I'll pass it over Mike after this. So what I've seen other districts do, or what typically the planning process is if you are trying to redevelop a house going on, typically a local government may require you to do a geotechnical study that actually goes around your property, assesses your property, sees all the risks to your specific property, and then makes recommendations of yes, build, don't build, or yes, build with some sort of protection for that structure. This report is not enough detail to actually go into that. So that may be required as part of a permitting process, but this report is not enough information. The qualified professional can use the information in this report for that understanding and knowledge, but it's not enough for a specific house or a specific property. But I'm going to pass it to Mike before we get off.
I really don't have an awful lot to add to that.
Okay, cool.
A very comprehensive answer.
Okay, cool.
So given the situation where we are,
Yeah.
3 to 5 years, is it wise not to start building if one hasn't? And you're in the very high risk?
If you're rebuilding in a very high risk, this is actually a really good opportunity to build the risk reduction at the same time that you're putting the new rebuild in. Because then you can design the houses in a way, both with, you know, a berm or something like that going on, but then also thinking about, okay, should I put the bedrooms? Where should I be putting the bedrooms of the house? Should I be making sure that there aren't windows on the upslope side of the house? So you can do a lot of things in the rebuild process during this time.
The permit that you have has to be changed.
I don't. Okay.
I'll attempt to speak to that, even though I'm not the permitting department. But those are all good comments that if you are rebuilding, consider all this. So I guess the caution something to consider is that the cost of rebuilding or the rebuild permit may require mitigation measures. Like if you're in high risk, it'll likely require mitigation measures to be in place in order for the TNRD to issue a permit. And that would require that specific geotech assessment of that related to that building permit. Now, I know that our planning department has already been in contact with the corporation around that process, and has already started that dialogue of how that process is going to work. So you could speak to that, Jeff? Yeah.
So just anybody who is considering building, they're willing to sit with us and have a meeting about and ask all those types of questions, what's going to be. So for you specifically, yeah. Because they had their permit process already done before, so I don't know in that specific.
Yeah, that's unique. I don't know either, but yeah, we'll connect through.
Yeah.
Go through. Yeah. So let's bring that one directly to the
Yes,
department.
they're happy to answer any questions about that stuff.
Yeah. And then you did mention the letter piece. So just so you're aware, if you see a plane flying over in the next few weeks, slowly going back and forth. So Cooksbury is planning on acquiring LiDAR for the fire scar. I don't know the exact sharing details, but they have Cook's Ferry Band is acquiring the LiDAR for the entire fire scar, which is basically, this is gonna sound really nerdy for a second, but it's a laser scan of the ground surface, and then we can digitally remove the trees from the ground surface and be able to tell features that are on the landscape that we can't see through the photographs that I've taken, that you can kind of see from aerials, from the planes that were flown. So it's a way that me as a geomorphologist can tell a lot about the landscape. So where landslides have been in the past. I've taken my best shot at where I think those have been, but that's all based on me tracing those out on, I can see in 3D, if I hold two pictures side by side that are taken slightly apart, if you hold your finger like this, really far out, and I'm telling you all to do this, even though you're older, I'm gonna make you do this because I made the kids do this all the time. So hold your finger out, way in front of you. Blink your finger back and forth. And or blink your eyes back and forth. What happens to your finger? It moves. Okay, now pull it closer to your face. What happens? It moves more. Okay, so that exact process gets used when you fly a plane over the ground and you take a bunch of pictures, is I can take two pictures that are side by side, taken slightly apart, and look at them side by side under like a special thing called a stereoscope, and I can see the ground in 3D through that method. And so that's how I've delineated all those different landforms, like the fans. I do that from old pictures, but it's way more accurate if I have that laser scan of the ground, because I can tell, you know, the exact contours of the ground underneath all the trees. So it's much more accurate. So there is a plan in place to be potentially acquiring that data, but I'm not entirely sure yet how it's going to be shared. It is being flown for Cook's Ferry for the purposes of the fire recovery. So plan in place, but we don't know yet what that looks like. And that would be like really specific information about somebody, you know, might be able to help build a berm or something like that if a local geotech was out. Yep.
Two questions. First, so a lot of this area behind us, not on the steep slope, but on the gradual slope.
Yep.
A lot of it is being there's plan to log it. So how does that affect debris, floods, or flows? Is it in the sense that is it better that the trees are not there so that you don't have like a whole bunch of trees flying at your house, or and maybe there's some benefits to it, maybe there's some, you know.
That's like a really hard question. In theory, if a tree is alive, it creates what's called roughness on the landscape and can actually slow flow, in theory, if it's alive. So what we see is sometimes debris flows stall, not in post-wildfire areas, but we see debris flows stall because they get all kind of caught up in trees and they kind of slow down that process. No, we're not talking about living trees. So in the post-fire scenario, those trees that are still remaining on the landscape might snap more easily and get incorporated. So there's a chance that they do get incorporated. But then if you also take every single tree out in a salvage logging process, you've basically removed any entire roughness to that surface. So I don't know what the actual answer is. Science doesn't even have the answer. It's kind of a catch-22. You do it, you do it. What I do know, and in several conversations with community members last fall and talking about salvage logging more generally, is the thing that I would say about salvage logging is you should be having discussions about what salvage logging can do to reduce risks to your community. So thinking about if you have a ton of machines and excavators in the community right now, how can you be using those machines and excavators to be doing the risk reduction measures? So thinking about that really hard and what that might look like, I would highly encourage you to do so in that case. And I know you're a community leader, so I'll leave you to that.
That was my second question. Because according to the report, I mean, there's all along there's risk, but for instance, this area has a high number of houses and a high level of risk.
Yeah.
And there's going to be a whole bunch of machines back there.
Yeah.
Potentially this fall. So is there, I mean, I guess maybe you have to hire a professional, but you know, the land is going that way.
Yeah.
So is there something just like that can be done that would actually help the whole situation, like it comes down and it goes that way?
Yeah.
I didn't think of that.
Yeah, so you can do in those circumstances, like if you do have a machine come out, you've designed that deflection structure, whatever that looks like, you can actually do that in those places. Lots of communities don't have those resources. And so that's a discussion you should be having and thinking about is if you are doing salvage logging and thinking about it, how can the salvage logging be useful to reduce risks to the community, both locally on the ground here, but also as the salvage logging progresses further up into the areas. And in some cases, salvage logging is a good thing because it's fixing the roads, those older road networks that are up there. You know, they've got clogged culverts, all those other kinds of things. They're fixing some of those clogged culverts that can cause all sorts of problems. So there are some benefits, but there are also trade-offs. So salvage logging can also create new road networks and can create different drainage channels that can move water in different ways. And in some cases, I'm not entirely convinced, and this is kind of a professional opinion, that salvage logging is the ultimate answer to reducing risks. I think we should be doing both in concert. Reducing risks in the upper hill slope, thinking about a rehabilitation plan for the watershed, and also be thinking about what can you effectively do to reduce risks on the ground down here.
And so a lot of that is, well, probably all of that is on Crown land.
Yeah.
So can we do anything? Like, it's not our private land, right? So if we want to put something in there, and maybe that's not a question for you. Sure. Well, can we do anything?
I'm not sure who has the answer to that question,
He's
but
got his hand up, so
It's like it's a little complicated.
Yeah.
Yeah, some good points there, and I like the way you're thinking, and certainly if the logging company is going to come in and offer to harvest your private land and make some money on that, you might say, what else benefit can you provide us, you know, for these trees that you're taking, besides monetary. So that's one thing to consider. And if you build something on private land, then that you're able to do that. That's for the most part all right. There's a few caveats. The Dike Maintenance Act says that if something technically meets the definition of a dike, which is you know, a berm designed to stop the flow, overland flow of water, which one could argue a debris flow or flood could be construed to be, and I'm getting into semantics, if it protects more than one private property, you know, then it should be registered as a dike and have a Dike Maintenance Act approval. And then there's all sorts of issues around the way the corporation is structured and, you know, how many private properties are there? They're technically 5. Are there 35? You know, I mean, that's yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You have private land.
Yeah, and then the last answer to your other question is, you know, are you allowed to build something on Crown land? And the answer is yes, but you need permission. So you would need to ask the Crown for a tenure, Crown land tenure to build something, and then that whatever you built would be the works that are pertinent to that tenure, and you'd be required to maintain them.
Yeah, the stumps don't. Yeah, the stumps don't do much, and whatever's left remaining there doesn't do much at this point. No. Okay, more questions?
I know that water will kind of take the path of least resistance, so like roads and that kind of thing. But does debris follow that same principle? So if I had a road surrounding my property, it may be helpful. Maybe. Potentially.
Okay, maybe. Yeah, that's a tricky answer. So generally water, yes, follows path of least resistance, steepest gradient, whatever that looks like. And debris flows can be a lot thicker than water is. And so there's a chance that it might actually go where you don't want it to go or actually stall and then go around that thing. So there's always a chance that it doesn't. Just water goes where it wants to go is the answer to that.
So in regards to the logging behind private property, is there any opportunity for the community that might be affected by that logging to have a say in whether that logging can take place?
Yeah.
There is, okay. Because I mean, it's all been sort of presented to us without really consulting us. It's like, yes, we will log back here this fall. And there hasn't been any mention to the community as to whether we want that or have a say in that in any way. And yeah, if you have a,
Essentially not our property, right? Okay.
Yeah, they'd like you to think that, but it's not necessarily the case. So essentially, the logging companies have to go to the province for a permit to log, and of course, the Ministry of Forest is in the business of moving timber, especially in situations like we have now with the harsh economic realities and closures. But it's definitely not a free for all. So like I said, they'd be required to have a qualified professional do a terrain stability assessment, and that would have to convince the forestry professionals on our side and the province's side that it's safe to do so. But moreover, and the name of the portal is not coming to mind, but the way it works is they put when they go to do this logging, they're required to advertise this fact in sort of all the local media that they can for the affected area. It's harder because we have less and less sort of print media in this current landscape. It's sort of more online, and then there's a portal that they have to put their plans on, and then the community is allowed to comment on those plans, and then the decision maker, so the person at the Ministry of Forests, has to consider those comments when they consider whether to approve that logging or not, right? So you really have to be kind of watching all those media channels and sites for and it might just be, did you say it was Interfor or Interwest? Interwest. Just say to them, have you put your plan out for consultation? Like I said, I'll get you my contact information, Jeffrey. Where have you done it? And they have to post. It's online, so you have to be able to access it online, but you put your comments in that way. There is a period if nobody comments, I think it's 3 months, then it closes, right? So hopefully it wasn't slid out there and at some time, 3.5 months ago, but
I think we should move off recording, if you're fine with that, just in case other folks have questions about that. Also, I desperately need water, so this is a good chance to break for that. And then, yeah, if folks want to talk about things privately, or you want things that are kind of off recording, I'm happy to stick around for a little bit after I drink water. Okay. Have something to eat, have something sugary. I promise it makes things a little bit easier to digest. And then make sure to take things